Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today we will be taking a look at the 2020 Los Angeles Valiant roster. This is one of the most interesting rosters in the league. They are a team that has done a lot to change their roster. They've done a lot to make their roster look different than what we saw last season. They've had a lot of changes to their team. So we're going to jump into that before we start talking about the moves that they made to bring in new players. So if you look at this team, if you look at what the players that were on this team at the beginning of the 2019 season versus now, there's a lot of changes. So of course, during the season they traded Fate, and in return got McGravy, Shax, and Fact Fiction. Then you had Bunny, who retired, and then I guess unretired. It's weird with Bunny. Yeah, Kooky, who retired and became the coach for Runaway. He's now with Florida Mayhem. Izayaki got traded to the Shanghai Dragons during the season. And then in the offseason, they traded Space to the LA Gladiators. They traded Kariv and Agilities to the Toronto Defiant. Fact Fiction got released, and Custa retired. And Custa, of course, retired to join the Overwatch League Talents team that was announced yesterday. So a lot of changes to this roster. A lot of players that are no longer with this team. So they had to do a lot to change their roster in every role. They had to basically bring in new starters everywhere. That was pretty much the position they found themselves in with this team. So looking at this team, one of the things that really stands out to me before I jump into things is they don't have an obvious leader on this team, like an obvious veteran leader, and I think that's going to be something that will be interesting to watch. But I want to start. I don't always talk about coaching staffs. I try to talk about them a decent amount, but I don't always talk about them. But I want to talk about Packing 10 because the job that Packing 10 did last season to turn the LA Valiant around and make them one of the best teams late in the season. In the second half of the season, I would argue that the LA Valiant were better than some of the teams that made the playoffs. They were better than the Philadelphia Fusion, in my opinion. They were better than the Chengdu Hunters, 100%. They were, in the second half of the season, possibly better than the NYXL. Until playoffs, of course, when NYXL really kind of started playing a much different style. So we've seen how the LA Valiant really turned around under Packing 10. And I think that is the idea, and that is the plan, is that Packing 10 is a really good head coach, and he can do a lot with a roster of a bunch of relatively unknown people and do a good job. And I think Packing 10 deserves a lot of credit for what he did last season, how he turned this team around. He is definitely someone who I think deserves tons and tons of credit for making this team what it was. But let's take a look at this team for what they are now. So 3 players return from the last season: KSF, Shax, and McGravy. Shax and McGravy, obviously, they acquired in the trade with the Florida Mayhem halfway through the season. KSF has been with the team though since 2018. He is the only player on this roster to still be here from that point in time. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting move by this team to add a lot of new players. But let's take a look at the different players and the different roles. We'll start with damage. Of course, KSF and Shax returning, so they are 2 players who are here and returning. I really like KSF as a player. I obviously am the self-appointed conductor of the KSF hype train. I think KSF is a really, really good player, a player who, in a lot of ways, gets kind of went under the radar. I think he's very good. He made the World Cup team for USA. He didn't play a ton in the World Cup, but he did play. I know for a fact he played at least one map against South Korea in the group stage, where he essentially won them the map. He it was a crazy map. It was Eichenwald. It was like the final push. He was playing Tracer, and he completely went off. It was amazing. Oh, I loved watching it. KSF's a very good player. He's a very underrated player. And when you hear a lot of the stuff that people have been saying about him going into the season, like, oh, we never really saw anything from KSF. We never did anything in the 2018 season, blah blah blah, which isn't true. We actually saw a lot of KSF in some of those fourth maps when they already won. But there was also a match, and I've talked about this a million times, against the San Francisco Shock late in the season where KSF played the entire match and looked really good. I thought he was a very good player, and I think he looked only better as the season progressed. Do I think he's the best American flex DPS player? No. Do I think he is one of the top 10 DPS players in the league? No. But I think he's good, and I think he has a lot of really good abilities as a player. The thing is, he's not the best hit scan player. Hanzo, McCree, Widowmaker are some of his best heroes, but he's not the best. So we'll have to see how he can hold up against a lot of these other really good hit scan players, but hit scan may not be that big into the meta, and they have enough room and enough roster space they can bring in somebody else. Of course, Shax is returning, another good player. Very, very, very deep hero pool. He can run the Tracer and the Widowmaker and the Sombra. You can also, of course, run the Reaper. We saw a lot of Sombra out of him last season. He did very, very well. He obviously is a player from Denmark. Denmark had a very good showing at the World Cup. Shax was playing there, so a good team that he's coming from, and he played well with the Valiant last season, so I think, a lot of really strong things coming out of Shax. I like him, and I like him paired with KSF. I think they make a good duo. You get a very flexible duo right there. And then you bring in Apply from formerly of, the Florida Mayhem, and then of Revival, and then of Third Impact. So he's been playing a lot of different places. He can play a lot. He's got a very good hero pool. He's got the Genji, the Pharah, the Junkrat. He's got more of your projectile DPS. I don't know who the Doomfist player would be on this team. I don't know if it would be Apply or Shax or KSF. I think we saw a lot of Shax Reaper late in the season last season, if I remember correctly. So I guess we could see Shax on Reaper. That's probably who he'll be playing, and then the Doomfist probably would then be KSF or Apply, whoever's better at it. We'll have to see, but I really do think that it's a very good DPS trio. It's good. It's not great. It's good. It's probably their best position in terms of experience with the Overwatch League. It definitely is. But it's not super strong. And there's not really an entire point in this roster I say it's super strong. They're going for the Philadelphia Fusion or Boston Uprising strategy that we saw back in 2018 that we saw was successful, of just building a team for relatively cheap and making them work really well together, and getting a team that works well together, that plays well together, and that's very tight in the way they play. I think that's their goal. We'll see what happens. Their DPS lineup is a little worrisome because I don't think they have anybody who really screams a Doomfist player. Maybe I'm just wrong, and that's maybe there's someone who's very obviously a strong DPS player that plays Doomfist, and I just haven't seen it. But it'll be interesting to see. But a lot of Florida Mayhem guys end up on this roster. They have 4 on this roster, former Florida Mayhem or Mayhem Academy people. So kind of crazy. Moving on to their tank line. They bring in Dreamer for their main tank. He is a Korean player, but he played in Australia. He played for the Sydney Drop Bears. He also played for Xavier Esports, which is a Thailand team. So he lived in Thailand, and then he went to Sydney Drop Bears, and now he's with the LA Valiant. So we have a Korean main tank player here. I think he's going to be an interesting player to watch and to follow. He is certainly a bit of a risk, but I believe that they had their open trials were all online, So if he was performing really well, getting some of that Thailand, Australia ping, he'll probably be pretty good. Um, Sydney Drop Bears have always been a good team in Australia, though this past season in Contenders wasn't great for them. When he played for Xavier, they were okay in Pacific. They weren't fantastic. So it's the kind of thing where there's a lot of risks that the LA Valiant are taking with this roster. It's not the most promising roster in my opinion, but I think it is what it is, and we'll see how it goes. Their flex tank, of course, losing space but keeping McGravy. McGravy had a decent amount of play a couple times in the early points of Stage 1 for the Florida Mayhem, but not a lot, and then he didn't really get any play with the LA Valiant because they had space. But I think McGravy is a good player. He's, I believe, the oldest player on this roster, so he is kind of the guy who has to be the leader and the veteran guy, and I think he'll do a pretty good job. But it's, once again, a little worrisome. He was solid on the Diva. I don't think we saw much out of him on Sigma. Maybe there was some that I just didn't see, but I don't think. No, we definitely didn't, because Sigma was only a thing in the playoffs. But so we haven't seen much of McGravy in that regard. So the tank line, I think, is also pretty good. It's not amazing. It's a downgrade, at least in the flex tank. Dreamer, in terms of fact fiction, I don't really know how good Dreamer is. I don't have a lot of experience watching Dreamer. So I would imagine they feel good about him as opposed to Fact Fiction. He's probably an upgrade. Fact Fiction's a good player, but I think he's got some teamwork issues. If I remember correctly, I could be wrong, but that's something I've heard a lot of people kind of comment about Fact Fiction. He's not a great team player. He's very intelligent. He knows the game very well. He understands ult charges very well, but I think he's just not the best team player. So that's something that they'll have to work with. But I think that this tank line's pretty good for what it is. It's not the best roster that they have, but I think this is one of the things that I think is not too bad. Finally, their support line. First is Rain, who previously played for the Florida Mayhem. Don't think he actually ever saw any stage time. He was with O2 Blast before that. Now, what's interesting about Rain is Rain has not actually officially been announced by the LA Valiant, but Halo of Thoughts has been reporting on Rain, and then there was also, I believe, an Overwatch League website that put Rain as a member of the LA Valiant, despite the fact that they had never announced him officially. So Rain is with the team, and that is something we know. He's going to be their main support, I would assume. The timing of them signing him makes me think that the other two supports they have, though one of them does have some history playing as a main support. My guess is they were planning on rolling with Custa. Custa came to them and said, hey, I'm going to retire. And then they said, okay, we're going to go find somebody. And they brought in Rain to be their new main support. Once again, I don't know a whole lot about Rain. I haven't seen a lot of him, but I assume he's a pretty good player if he was on an Overwatch League roster. Like I said, he didn't play a lot. I don't think he played at all. He maybe played a little bit, but we'll have to see what he brings out. But he's going to be the main support player. And he's going to be playing most likely alongside Lastro, who formerly was playing for Sky Foxes. He was with Stormquake, World GameStar H2. He's a Korean player. He's I've heard a lot of very good things about him. He was someone who I think had a pretty decent showing with Sky Foxes. He comes to the obviously the LA Valiant, and he definitely not an upgrade over Kareev, but he's good, and I think he'll be a good part to this roster. And then finally, you have Slur, British player, another flex support player, though also plays some main support as well. Some Mercy, some Moira in there, so he could also play alongside Lastro, but I think Lastro is going to be their starting flex support with Rain in as their main support, maybe Slur depending on who they need. But the thing that really has me concerned about this Valiant team is they don't have, like I said, that leadership figure. They don't have that veteran presence, and they have a lot of unproven players. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say the fact that the Valiant have a lot of unproven players means they're going to have a bad season. What I am going to say is they have a lot of unproven players, which means it's difficult to say, hey, this team's going to be really good, or hey, this team's going to be really, really bad. And it's difficult for me to say, either way. I think the Valiant are definitely one of the weakest teams in the league, and I think there is a lot going on with the Valiant trying to build a team without having to spend a lot of money. And this is a team that I would expect, based on what we saw from them last season and the rumors from what was going on with them during the season, earlier in the season with the Boston Uprising trade that never happened, I would expect that this is a team that if things aren't working out early in the season, they're going to make moves to try to improve. And we saw them during the 2018 or 2019 season struggle early on. And a lot of people just said, just don't even focus on this season, focus on next season. And the Valiant said no. And they focused on trying to improve. They did what they wanted to do to improve. They built a roster that maybe wasn't going to be a championship roster, but they still did all they could to go for the playoffs. And I thought that was a good move on their part. And I think they are a team that will make moves if they need to. They have open roster spots. There are tons of really talented players that are out there that are not on the team right now that you could pick up. If your main tank isn't something you're happy with, there's always Tizzy, or there is always Bumper out there who you could bring in. If main support's a problem, you could bring in Jexa. If flex support's a problem, you could go for a trade for a player like... the Spitfire have a couple, but you could go for a trade for a player like Boombox if you wanted him, to bring in a little more of a veteran leadership figure there. You could obviously bring in another flex support player who's out there. And there's obviously tons of talented players and contenders as well. I expect the Valiant to make moves if they feel like they need to. They're a team that has done a lot to change their roster. They've done a lot to, move players up and down and do a lot of things with them. So I'd expect this team to be one that is not afraid to change their roster if they feel that they need to. So it's an interesting roster. Definitely one of the weaker rosters in the league. I would not say the worst roster in the league or anything like that, but I think they are certainly down there, and I think that they are a team that we will have to see a lot from them going forward, and we'll have to see kind of how they play as a unit before we really can say for sure how good or not this team is. So those are my thoughts on this team. That's all I have for you today. Let me know your own thoughts for the LA Valiant in the comments down below. I'd love to hear them, but I'm going to get out of here. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing for more content like this in the future. But I'm going to get out of here. Thank you once again. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.